The city lights danced against wet pavement on a cold, drizzly evening. People huddled beneath umbrellas, and cars hissed by on the slick streets. Through the haze of rain, a crowded bus lurched to a stop, its doors wheezing open to let in late-night commuters. Among the passengers was Margaret, an older woman whose eyes reflected exhaustion and a quiet sadness. She clutched a time-worn purse with trembling hands, her expression tense as she scanned for an empty seat. No seats remained, so she stood near the exit, carefully gripping a metal pole as the driver pulled away from the curb. Next to her, a young man named Ethan, her son, muttered curses under his breath. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other, obviously impatient. His shoulders were rigid with annoyance, and every so often, he would let out an exasperated sigh meant to draw attention. Margaret's bag slipped off her shoulder slightly, and she tried to adjust it. In doing so, she brushed against Ethan's jacket sleeve. He shot her a glare that bristled with frustration. "You always do that," he snapped, voice slicing through the hush of the late hour. Several passengers lifted their heads at the sudden outburst, some tightening their grips on their phones while others looked out rain-streaked windows to avoid the tension. Margaret's mouth opened, but only a soft whisper emerged. "I'm sorry, Ethan," she managed, trying to keep her voice calm. Her hand quivered as she steadied herself against the pole. The bus jolted, and she stumbled into him once again. This time Ethan didn't just glare. He raised his voice. "Seriously? You can't even keep your balance?" He crossed his arms and huffed. "It's always me who ends up dealing with your mistakes." She closed her eyes for a second, as though collecting the fragments of her composure. "I'm doing my best," she replied quietly, glancing around to see if anyone was paying attention. A few people met her gaze with sympathy, but most kept to themselves. Ethan either didn't see or didn't care about the watchful eyes. "Your best isn't good enough," he muttered, loud enough for the nearest passengers to hear. His tone was jagged, sharp with long-held grievances. "You can't even remember the address I gave you earlier, right? Now we're stuck on this bus, in the rain, and you still don't have a clue." Margaret's face paled. She tried to speak, but it was as though the words lodged in her throat. Her trembling fingers clutched her purse tighter, seeking comfort in the familiar fabric. She mustered the courage to say, "I'm sorry I forgot. Maybe we can just ask the driver or someone else for directions." Ethan scoffed. "Sure. Let's just tell everyone how helpless you are. You think anybody cares about us right now?" He gestured broadly at the bus, where passengers stared intently at phones or out the window, pretending not to listen. A few seats away, a teenage girl wearing headphones glanced up. Her eyes flickered with unease as she registered the hostility in Ethan's words. She tugged at her friend's sleeve, quietly suggesting they record the scene on a phone. Maybe it was an automatic reaction. After all, capturing dramatic moments had become second nature in a world of social media. Another passenger, an older gentleman in a brown coat, frowned deeply at Ethan's outburst. Yet he remained silent, eyes lowered to the floor. The bus lurched again, jostling Margaret forward. She collided lightly with Ethan, who reacted with a venomous glare. "Watch it," he snapped, shrugging her away. "You're lucky I even let you stay with me. You'd be on the streets if it were up to Dad." Margaret's eyes flashed with hurt. "Your father left years ago, Ethan." "That wasn't my fault," she murmured, gripping the pole with knuckles white as bone. It was evident that the mention of Ethan's father sliced through deeper wounds than he cared to admit. Ethan rolled his eyes but said nothing. His foot tapped against the bus floor in a staccato of frustration. Rain pounded the windows, muffling the hum of the engine. In that cramped space, the tension was palpable, a silent pressure that weighed on every passenger. Near the back of the bus, barely noticeable at first, sat Keanu Reeves. He wore a dark coat zipped up against the chill and held a small leather bag in his lap. His posture was calm, but his gaze was fixed on Ethan and Margaret. He observed the entire exchange, eyes revealing a blend of empathy and quiet resolve. Though no one recognized him yet in the dim lighting, there was an almost magnetic aura about him. He did not intervene immediately, perhaps waiting to see if someone else would step up. But as time wore on, It became clear that no one else dared. Margaret kept her eyes on the floor as the bus rattled over potholes. The overhead lights flickered each time the driver hit the brakes, creating brief moments of semi-darkness that seemed to mirror her sinking spirits. She pressed her lips together, exhaling slowly, willing herself not to cry. The quiet hush from surrounding passengers provided no solace. It merely amplified the bitterness hanging in the air. Ethan leaned against the metal railing, frustration visible in every tensed muscle. "Mom, you're making everything worse. I told you to meet me at the right stop, and you picked the wrong one. I wasted my time going back for you." His words held a cold edge, each syllable a small punch to Margaret's already aching heart. From several rows away, an older woman with silver-streaked hair watched with pained concern. She glanced at the nearest passenger, who gave a helpless shrug. Some people at least recognized that Margaret was being verbally battered, but nobody seemed to know how to intervene. Their eyes reflected a common question. Was it even their place to interfere between a mother and her adult son? Ethan pointed a finger toward his mother, voice rising. "Now we're both stuck on this late bus, and we'll probably miss the apartment showing. Do you have any idea how hard it is to find a decent place in this city?" The words rang out, accompanied by the squeak of windshield wipers fighting a losing battle against the downpour. Margaret whispered, "I'm sorry, Ethan. I really am." She looked genuinely remorseful, as though she believed that every inconvenience he experienced was her personal failing. It was a look that struck a chord with at least a few observers who shifted in their seats, uneasy with Ethan's anger. A short, abrupt laugh escaped Ethan's lips. "Sorry doesn't fix anything, I swear. You can't do the simplest tasks without me holding your hand. It's embarrassing." His voice echoed, bouncing off the quiet hush around them. One could almost hear the unspoken judgments swirling in the air. Some passengers clenched their jaws or fidgeted, but still, no one spoke up. In the back, Keanu Reeves inhaled a slow breath. His eyes narrowed, but his posture remained calm. He readjusted the strap of his leather bag and glanced toward the aisle, where a teenage boy was discreetly filming Ethan's tirade with his phone. Keanu's gaze flicked toward the phone, then back to Ethan. It was as if he was weighing whether to act, acknowledging that in today's world, interventions can go viral within seconds. Yet something deeper in his expression suggested that he believed this situation needed a human solution, not just a digital one. Ethan shook his head and jammed his hands into his pockets. "You're the reason Dad left, you know," he muttered bitterly, his voice slicing through Margaret's remaining composure. A flash of torment crossed her face, and she let out a small, involuntary gasp. It was a direct hit, the kind of comment that left her struggling to form words. A middle-aged man near the front gave Ethan a stern look, but then turned away as though deciding it wasn't worth the risk of public confrontation. A hush fell once again, broken only by the squealing brakes as the bus jerked to a brief halt at a red light. Margaret's eyes shone with tears that she fought to hold back. The mere mention of her ex-husband conjured memories that cut deep. She sighed, "That's not true, Ethan. Your father. He had his reasons, but it wasn't just about me. It never was." Her voice shook, each word uncertain. Ethan scoffed. "Keep telling yourself that, Mom. If you were different, he would have stayed. And if you were different now, we wouldn't be on a bus in the middle of the night, dealing with all this." A wave of discomfort rippled through the bus. The teenager recording quietly whispered, "Whoa," to a friend, who shook their head in disbelief. Others stared hard at the floor, perhaps reminded of their own regrets or their own family conflicts they never dared address. Margaret turned her face away, trying to conceal the tears that finally escaped and slid down her cheeks. The bus's engine roared, pulling them forward once again. Outside, the relentless storm hammered the city streets. Inside, emotional storms brewed in hearts that seemed too wary or scared to intervene. Finally, a soft chime signaled that someone had pulled the cord to request a stop. The bus slowed, hissing as it eased against the curb. A couple of passengers hurried out, grateful, perhaps, to escape the tension. Others, however, remained, their eyes darting between Ethan, Margaret, and the mysterious man at the back who seemed to radiate quiet purpose. No one knew his name or his intentions, only that he was watching with a composure that felt both reassuring and disconcerting. Margaret brushed away a tear with the back of her hand, turning her gaze downward again. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was almost too soft to hear. "Ethan," she began, trying to muster some resolve. "Maybe we can talk about this when we're not so upset. Please, let's just get to the apartment safely." Ethan barked out a single note of laughter. "Talk? You never listen, Mom. Even if we do talk, you'll forget everything by morning. I'm tired of cleaning up your messes." He waved a dismissive hand, as though swatting away an annoying fly. At the back of the bus, Keanu Reeves made his decision. He slowly rose from his seat, gripping the leather bag in one hand, steadying himself with the other as the bus lurched once more. His silhouette momentarily blended with the dim interior lights, but his calm face soon came into clearer focus. An onlooker noticed first, nudging a friend and whispering, "Wait a second, isn't that?" Keanu walked toward the front, each step measured and deliberate. Heads turned his way, some in astonishment, others in curiosity. Ethan glanced over, noticing how other passengers fell silent. He followed their line of sight until he locked eyes with Keanu. A spark of surprise flickered across Ethan's face, but he hardened his expression as though preparing for confrontation. Margaret sensed a shift in the atmosphere and looked up. She saw this tall man in a dark coat, exuding a gentle but unmistakable authority, approaching them with steady resolve. Confusion mingled with nervousness on her face. Who was he? And why had he finally decided to step in? The bus seemed suspended in a collective hush as Keanu Reeves stopped just a few steps away from Ethan and Margaret. The rumble of the engine and the persistent patter of rain against the windows served as a muted backdrop. Almost all eyes gravitated to Keanu, an unspoken question filling the air. Would he intervene, or simply pass by like another passenger? Keanu's voice broke the silence. It was calm, steady as the heartbeat of someone unafraid of confrontation. "Excuse me," he began, looking first at Margaret, then at Ethan. "I couldn't help but notice the situation here." Ethan furrowed his brow, still defensive. "And who asked you to notice?" he snapped, though there was a flicker of doubt in his tone. Now that he'd recognized Keanu's face, a part of him seemed uncertain whether antagonizing this stranger was wise. Keanu maintained eye contact, his expression neither confrontational nor submissive. "No one asked," he replied with gentle clarity, "but sometimes we do things not because we're asked, but because it's the right thing to do." That statement hung in the air. Margaret shifted her weight, clutching her purse closer as though it provided a barrier against the swirl of emotions. She glanced briefly at Ethan, who was breathing heavily, caught between anger and embarrassment. A teenager near the aisle angled her phone, quietly trying to capture the unfolding scene. Another passenger gently lowered the teen's hand, whispering, "Let them have their moment," and, surprisingly, the teen obliged. Keanu continued, "I see a young man who's obviously frustrated, and a mother who's carrying more pain than she should. I don't know your story." He paused, eyes traveling from Ethan's clenched fists to Margaret's tear-streaked cheeks. "But I can see that words spoken in anger can hurt more than physical blows." Ethan scoffed, but his bravado had lost some of its edge. "You don't know anything about us. My life is complicated, and she's always messing it up." Keanu nodded thoughtfully, as though genuinely considering Ethan's words. "Life can be complicated. Parents aren't perfect, they make mistakes, just like we do. But I've also learned that you never truly understand what your mother has done for you until she's not around to do it anymore." A surge of emotion rippled through the bus. One or two passengers shifted uncomfortably, remembering their own regrets or lost opportunities. Margaret swallowed hard, tears still glistening at the corners of her eyes. She watched Keanu with a mixture of gratitude and disbelief, as if she couldn't fathom why this stranger cared enough to get involved. Ethan cast a quick glance around, realizing that everyone was listening. That sense of being judged or pitted flared his temper. "So, you think you can just waltz in here and fix everything with some lecture? You don't know what I've been through." He hesitated, searching for words that could justify his anger. She's forgetful and constantly messing things up, okay? She left me stranded once when I was a kid. I waited for her for hours. Margaret flinched at the reminder, her grip on her purse tightening. She whispered, Ethan, I'm sorry for that. I never meant to. Enough, Ethan interrupted, though his tone wavered. Keanu regarded the two with a sympathetic gaze, taking a step closer to Margaret. I believe you're sorry, he said softly, acknowledging her pain. Then he turned back to Ethan. Your hurt is real, but it's not an excuse to mistreat her. Especially not here, where she's vulnerable, with nowhere else to go. Look around. Every person on this bus can feel the weight of this moment. Ethan's eyes darted across the aisle, noticing the stares, the quiet hush that had enveloped everyone. He shifted uncomfortably. I'm just tired, he finally admitted, though the resentment still clung to his voice. She wasn't supposed to be my burden. My dad should have stayed. None of this should have happened. Margaret, who'd been silent except for muffled apologies, attempted to speak. Her voice was shaky, but determined. I never wanted to burden you, Ethan. I know I've made mistakes. I know I forget things sometimes. But I love you, and I'm trying my best. Keanu stood between them, looking from one to the other. Everybody tries their best. In one way or another, he said gently, and sometimes that best isn't perfect. But the wounds you're causing tonight? They might never fully heal unless you both decide to meet each other with compassion. Ethan opened his mouth to retort, but the words seemed to fail him. A storm raged behind his eyes. Anger, guilt, fear, and maybe a yearning for things he couldn't even articulate. Margaret looked at her son with an open vulnerability, giving him permission to see her not just as a flawed mother, but as a human being. The bus hit a bump, jostling everyone. Keanu reached out to steady Margaret with one hand, planting his feet firmly. The abrupt motion seemed to snap Ethan out of his defensive posture. He glanced at his mother's worn shoes, the frayed edges of her purse, the lines on her face, and the tears that streaked her cheeks. Realization flickered across his features. He was causing someone he cared about immeasurable sorrow. Quietly, Keanu guided Margaret to an open seat that someone vacated just moments prior. She sank into it, exhaling a slow breath. Ethan stood there, gaze darting between the seat, Keanu, and the floor. I'm not asking you to forget your pain, Keanu spoke again, voice low but audible to those around. Just remember that someday, you'll wish you had the chance to speak kindly, to offer patience, to ask for forgiveness, or give it. A hush followed his words. Some passengers swallowed hard, others exchanged glances of empathy. The bus hurtled through the rain-soaked streets, but inside, time seemed suspended by the raw tension of the moment. In that silence, Ethan finally began to understand that what he said next could alter the path he and his mother walked together from here on out. Ethan's breath came in shallow bursts as he stood over Margaret, who clutched her purse like it was a lifeline. The city lights filtered through the rain-smeared windows, casting odd reflections across the bus interior. A mixture of shame and pent-up anger warred on his face. Nearby, Keanu Reeves waited, his calm presence an unspoken invitation for Ethan to let down his guard. At last, Ethan lowered his gaze. His voice trembled with repressed feelings. I've been so angry, he admitted, glancing warily at his mother. Ever since Dad left, I felt like everything was on me. You started forgetting little things, missing appointments, needing my help all the time. It felt like I had to be the adult. Margaret's eyes brimmed with fresh tears. She reached for his hand, but he flinched, as though contact might unravel him completely. I understand, she whispered. I wish I could go back and fix the times I failed you. Ethan let out a bitter laugh, though it lacked its former edge. I know you do, Mom, but it still hurts. The memories don't just vanish, you know? Keanu nodded quietly, watching the interplay of pain and regret. The rest of the bus seemed captivated, enveloped in a tangible empathy. Even the engine's drone and the patter of rain couldn't break the spell. Hurt doesn't vanish, Keanu agreed softly. But people can choose how they carry it and how they let it shape their words. Ethan's shoulders slumped. He rubbed a hand across his face, as if trying to wipe away the tension. "I've said terrible things tonight," he muttered, no longer able to meet Margaret's eyes. "I keep pushing you away when maybe all you needed was patience." A small sob escaped Margaret as she fumbled to stand. Keanu offered her a steadying arm, but she gently brushed it aside to rise on her own. She faced her son, slight tremors coursing through her body. "I'm so sorry, Ethan," she repeated. "I know I wasn't perfect. Sometimes I get confused. Sometimes I forget little details. But I've never forgotten how much I love you." Ethan bit his lip, wrestling the tears that threatened to spill. In a hushed moment, he extended his hand, and she took it. Their fingers interlaced, bridging a gap that had seemed insurmountable just minutes before. The bus jostled to another stop, and a few passengers discreetly alighted, though several lingered, riveted by this unfolding reconciliation. A subdued hush filled the space, broken only by the groan of the bus's brakes and the drumming of rain against glass. At length, Ethan cleared his throat. "Mom," he said, voice wavering but sincere, "I don't want to keep hurting you. I don't want to be the reason you feel alone. Sometimes I feel so overwhelmed." Margaret squeezed his hand tighter, tears welling in her eyes. "You're not alone, Ethan. We both have been trying to do this on our own. Maybe we should try to understand each other instead of blaming." Keanu allowed a small, encouraging smile. His presence felt like a calm anchor in the swirling sea of emotion. "It takes courage to admit our faults, and it takes love to accept another person's. Tonight, you both showed a bit of that, even if it came at a painful price." Ethan glanced at him, swallowing hard. "I'm sorry for snapping at you," he added grudgingly. I didn't know who you were or why you were getting involved." Keanu shook his head. "You don't have to apologize to me. Sometimes, all a stranger can do is shine a light on what's already there." He gestured gently at Margaret's hand holding Ethan's. "I think you two are seeing each other a little more clearly now." Ethan exhaled, releasing tension he'd been gripping for what felt like years. He turned back to his mother. "I'll try to be more patient," he said. "I promise. But if I slip up, or if you forget something, can we talk about it? Like, really talk?" Margaret nodded, wiping away her tears with the edge of her sleeve. "Yes, of course. We can work through this together." A sense of resolution, fragile but genuine, settled over the pair. Around them, the bus's interior brightened, perhaps from a passing street lamp or simply from the intangible glow of a mother and son finding common ground. A quiet wave of relief seemed to ripple through the other passengers. The tension that had coiled around everyone eased, replaced by a subdued kind of hope. Keanu gently motioned toward a newly vacated seat so both mother and son could sit. Ethan guided Margaret over, and they sank onto the seats with shoulders touching, an intimacy that spoke of a new willingness to be close without hostility. In the hush that followed, a woman near the front dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. The teenage girl who had considered filming now rested her phone on her lap, a thoughtful expression on her face. An older gentleman lowered his head, possibly reflecting on relationships in his own life. The driver, focused on navigating slick roads, peered in the rearview mirror as though sensing a shift in the bus's emotional landscape. After a moment, Keanu stepped back to give Ethan and Margaret space. He positioned himself by a pole near the middle of the bus, quietly gazing out the window where neon lights glistened against the night sky. The vehicle rumbled onward, each passenger absorbing the moment in their own personal way. For a few more stops, no one spoke. It was a comforting silence, gently broken by the hum of the heater and the occasional wet squeak of windshield wipers. Margaret rested her head on Ethan's shoulder, and he didn't pull away. Instead, he placed a tentative arm around her back. It was a small gesture, but to Margaret, it felt like a momentous step forward. Keanu watched them, the faintest smile touching his lips. This was not a staged scene for cameras or social media. It was raw human emotion laid bare. A mother reclaiming the respect of her son, and a son grappling with the realization that no frustration or resentment should justify cruelty. Outside, the rain showed no signs of stopping, yet inside the bus, something far more uplifting than the weather had taken hold. Ethan and Margaret sat together for several minutes, each absorbing the gravity of what had just transpired. A gentle warmth seemed to radiate between them, forming a tentative peace, while the storm outside continued to drench the world in cold, persistent rain. Something within the bus felt entirely different, almost serene. It was as though a collective exhale had spread among the passengers, uniting them in silent reflection. At last, Ethan broke the silence, his voice subdued but earnest. "Mom, about the apartment," he paused, cheeks flushing slightly with guilt. "I wanted to find a new place so we could have a fresh start, away from reminders of everything. Maybe I should have told you that instead of yelling." Margaret managed a soft smile. "I understand. I really do. But no matter where we move, we'll always have our memories. We can't just leave them behind, but maybe we can learn to move forward together." Her words settled into the air, a soothing reassurance that things could be different if they both chose it. Several seats behind them, Keanu Reeves allowed himself a faint nod of approval, hearing enough to know they were making progress. He had stepped in when he sensed that Margaret needed a voice she herself couldn't muster. But now mother and son were speaking without the venom that had initially coated Ethan's every word. It was a transformation as subtle as the change of night into dawn, but just as undeniable. As the bus rolled to the next stop, a middle-aged woman wearing a rain-spattered coat stood up to exit. Before stepping off, she looked toward Margaret and Ethan. Her eyes glistened with unshed tears, and though she didn't speak, her nod conveyed empathy and respect. The door hissed shut behind her, and the bus rumbled forward once more. Margaret noticed the small gesture, her heart swelling with gratitude. She turned to Ethan, who gently squeezed her hand in response. The quietness around them spoke louder than any applause. The subdued atmosphere reflected a collective recognition of their courage to confront hurt and mend it in real time. Eventually, Keanu moved down the aisle, pausing beside their seats. "You're both stronger than you realize," he said quietly. "Don't forget that." His gaze shifted between them, compassion in his eyes. "And remember, forgiveness is a choice you get to make every day. You won't always get it right, but trying is half the battle." Ethan swallowed, then nodded. "Thank you," he whispered, and Margaret echoed his sentiment with a trembling but heartfelt smile. It was clear she was still processing the emotional impact of the evening, yet relief now shone in her eyes. The bus slowed to a halt at another stop. The teenager who'd once considered filming the altercation stood, her face reflecting a blend of humility and insight. As she passed, she quietly said, "I'm glad I didn't post that. This feels more important to keep personal." She offered Ethan and Margaret a small smile and stepped off into the rain. They each watched her go, a silent acknowledgement that sometimes the most meaningful moments in life are best cherished privately rather than broadcast online. The bus doors closed, and the vehicle lurched forward again. Ethan shifted, turning to his mother more fully. "We'll figure out the apartment," he said, voice strengthened by a new determination. "We'll figure out everything. I can't promise I won't get frustrated, but I'll try not to take it out on you." Margaret lifted her other hand to cover his gently. "That's all I could ask for," she replied, eyes shining. "I'll try to remember the things that matter more carefully, and if I forget sometimes, just remind me." Gently. Their conversation continued in hushed tones, the raw bitterness replaced by something warmer, tentative acceptance laced with hope. Some of the passengers who had borne witness to the heated exchange now turned their attention elsewhere. The crisis seemed over, replaced by a palpable sense of resolution. They sensed that what remained was something private, a mother and son healing in real time. After a few more stops, Keanu quietly pulled the cord, signaling the driver. He slung his leather bag over his shoulder, moving toward the exit. Margaret noticed him leaving and raised her hand in a small wave. "Thank you," she called softly. Ethan echoed the sentiment with a nod, his eyes following Keanu until he disappeared into the hush of the rainy night. The bus's doors closed behind him, and the wheels hissed against the wet pavement. For a moment, Margaret and Ethan simply watched the droplets trail down the window, illuminated by city lights. Neither spoke, but in the quiet, there was no tension, only a newfound sense of togetherness. Over the next several blocks, the bus gradually emptied. Night had stretched on, and the schedule neared its end. By the time Ethan and Margaret's stop arrived, the driver offered a gentle smile as they stood to leave. They stepped off into the rain, pulling their coats tighter around them, but somehow the cold felt less biting. Ethan lifted an umbrella, holding it over his mother, shielding her from the downpour. She gave him a grateful look, and they walked together along the soaked sidewalk. The hush of traffic and the rhythmic drumming of droplets on fabric provided a calming symphony for the changes unfolding in their relationship. No bright lights or loud fanfare marked this moment. It was a quiet victory. They had faced their pain under the watchful eyes of strangers and emerged on the other side with understanding, if not absolute clarity. And somewhere in the city's labyrinth, Keanu Reeves continued his own journey, leaving a profound reminder in his wake. Compassion and respect can turn a moment of anger into a turning point, changing lives in the process. Life has a way of thrusting us into unexpected moments that test our character. For Ethan and Margaret, the bus ride began as a clash of frustrations and hidden wounds. Public anger and private hurts collided in a confined space where everyone else watched from the sidelines, unsure whether or how to intervene. The turning point came when one compassionate bystander, Keanu Reeves, stepped forward with gentle but firm words. His timely intervention offered a mirror to both mother and son, revealing that beneath the shouting and harsh accusations lay a need for understanding and forgiveness. In that brief encounter, strangers transformed into witnesses of vulnerability, empathy, and renewal. Ethan recognized the depth of his mother's pain, and Margaret felt her son's unspoken insecurities. With honesty and courage, they exposed old wounds and took the first steps toward healing them. All it took was a compassionate reminder, one that resonates for anyone who has ever harbored resentment, hurt, or regret. When someone stands up and says, "This is not okay," they invite us all to reassess the words we wield so carelessly. As they left the bus that night, Ethan and Margaret carried not just the memory of conflict, but also the promise of change. It's a reminder that family conflicts, misunderstandings, and lingering resentments can be righted if we choose empathy over anger. We may not always get it perfect on the first try, but as they learned, the effort to understand one another can lead to remarkable breakthroughs. And for everyone else on that bus, and perhaps those reading or hearing about the story, this incident stands as proof that the smallest act of compassion can have the greatest impact. We have a choice in each moment: stay silent or step up. The right choice, as Keanu demonstrated, can transform lives.